everybody. Hi. Hello. Hello. Thank you all for coming to this panel. It's good to see you here. My name is Akiva Friedland. I'm at 2L Stanford Law School. I hope you, I know we were promised to have Debbie Mukamal moderating this panel, but in the spirit of this being a student law conference, she urged me to do it because I am hosting the panel. So thank you, Debbie. Sorry, all of you. But to make up for it, we have some really great advocates here who are going to talk about, as you know, the concept, not just clients, community partnerships against mass incarceration. I'm going to introduce them very briefly, and then we're going to have 40 minutes or so of vigorous debate, and if we can tame that vigorous debate, we're going to try to leave 10 minutes at the end for questions from you all. So the very brief introductions beginning at the far end is Mr. Raj Jayadev, right? Yeah. Raj, of Silicon Valley Debug, which is a nonprofit organization here in Silicon Valley that works on workers' rights and various issues that affect low-income people and communities in the Valley. I'll tell you more about that. And specifically here today, I asked him to come here because his organization started something called the Alberto Ruiz Justice Project, which helps train people in the community to intercede in the criminal court cases of their loved ones and their own cases, largely in response to failures of the public defender system to investigate and defend people. And I think he can talk more about this, but I'm pretty sure that in Santa Clara County until 2009, there were no public defenders in misdemeanor court. Is that right?
Out of custody misdemeanor.
Yes, so that's pretty insane. We'll hear more about that. Okay. Next we have Maurice M. Salem of the National Employment Law Project. He has done a lot, and his organization has done a lot of work around issues that are, they intersect with mass incarceration and its effects. They're largely focused on employment, especially barriers to reentry into the workforce. And he has been involved in some multifaceted campaigns around that. He's going to tell us about that. And finally, Glenn E. Martin from New York. Thank you very much for coming out here. Now the founder and chief risk taker at Just Leadership USA, which is committed to cutting mass incarceration in half by 2030. He's going to tell you about how he intends to go about that. So let's get started. I'm going to ask some general questions about these issues and about movements around these issues. Is there a movement around these issues? And then we'll also ask some questions that are more specific to you guys. And I can take it away. Yes, depends if we let. But yeah, that's fine. So, kind of the premise for this is that right now, if you care about the effects of mass incarceration, if you think that criminal justice system is broken, that it is a racialized carceral enterprise, basically, that you might have some reason to be hopeful right now, because we see voices on the right and on the left talking about reforming some of the most blatantly damaging sentencing and corrections policies. And I share in that optimism, but I'm also pretty sure that, and I want to know what you guys think, about what will happen if we just make some piecemeal reforms and then everyone goes home. And meanwhile, people who are really affected are still being affected. So do you see a cause for optimism right now, and how do you temper that against the knowledge that it's so easy to win a little tip of the iceberg victory? So take it away.
I'm not a lawyer, but I think you're leading the witness. Let me take the first swing at that. So I've been an advocate for 13 years now on this issue. I have never sort of bought into this idea that we are in the midst of a significant movement at this point. I do believe that because of the way philanthropy is structured, because of the way nonprofits support their work, that unfortunately we're pretty fractured in our approach to the work. And because we haven't invested heavily in the people that have the most interest in the outcome of our work. You know, we don't really have a movement. I think if you look retrospectively at what movements look like, The people who are closest to the problem are often closest to the solution, and they are a meaningful part of the work to reform the system. And I don't think we're there yet on this issue. I think we're in the midst of a conversation about what that looks like and how to do it and do it well, but I don't think that's really happening. The other thing that hugely concerns me is that systems of oppression have a way of being durable and reinventing themselves. And what I'm seeing in this movement is, how do we move people away from being incarcerated? Great. But it seems to be a movement towards community-based prisons. Or, you know, the idea that probation, for instance, is some sort of alternative to incarceration is just not true. I mean, probation and parole have grown alongside our incarceration system, and so my concern is, again, that we end up lowering the number of people in prison, and when we look back, we realize that it morphed into some other system of oppression. And so the way I think you avoid that is, again, by having the people from the communities most impacted, helping to drive the work in leadership, and really setting the boundaries for other advocates in the field. And I hope we get to talk a bit about what that looks like from my perspective, and what my experience has been as a non-lawyer, working with lawyers for the past 13 years.
Maybe, Raj, could you take this up, because your work is, from what I understand of it, the Justice Project's work kind of grew up out of a real immediate need to create a structure in the community that was not being met. So in a sense, it's kind of a result of that fracturing, but also a beautiful flower of the fracturing. And maybe, you know, if you could tell us a bit about how these ideas relate.
Sure, absolutely. I love that our work is called A Comparatively Beautiful Flower. It's on our website. But yeah, just to connect the dots with our local work here, and I hope this is an introduction that we'll be seeing you more, because I'm like 20 minutes away from you and you need your help. To pick up the points that Glenn really articulately gave us as a framework, I would agree that what we've been talking about in terms of these incremental gains, so to speak, certainly can be positive, certainly is affecting people's lives, of who is locked behind bars and who is not. But does it resemble, or does it have the ingredients of a movement, I think is a different question. And here's what we know about grand social movements. They're not made by Supreme Court declarations, and they're not won at ballot boxes. They're won, as Glenn said, by directly impacted people, transforming the institutions that were controlling them and taking power over them, and remolding the sort of legacy or direction of the future of the country. And I think another vulnerability of the current moment, in terms of wanting to be somewhat optimistic, to encourage positive actions and thinking, but at the same time retain a certain critical eye about its inherent limitations, is some of these victories that have been happening in California, and I think out of the state, have hinged upon the economic irrationality of mass incarceration, which is certainly there and certainly true, but it leaves it vulnerable to the ebbs and flows of that economics. And so when something is politically palpable and palatable, then it's okay to say we want to move away from prisons and jails. But we know in California these things turn on a dime. And so not addressing the ethical and moral issues of mass incarceration, I think, makes it so this thing could really be a blip, or more transitory than we'd like. And to answer Akila's point, you know, we work with families and individuals whose loved ones are facing criminal charges, and as the panel next door is talking about, also immigration court. The way to build movement in our mind is for folks who are directly impacted to feel the capacity and agency of their own power. So the measuring stick is, do they feel a sense of transformation from the experience? And so for us, mass incarceration isn't so much an Eric Holder press release. Quite frankly, it's not even a great book. It's whether they are walking into a court and knowing that they're not just the recipient or on the receiving end of a process, but they have the agency to intervene and change the outcome of what happens in that process. That opportunity exists in every community in this country. And that's why I think movement is so good.
tell us a bit about how, do you see the potential for this kind of action by people affected by the issues that you're working on? How have you partnered with people who are affected by, say, the Ban the Box campaign? If you could talk a little bit about that and touch on some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't have a more articulate, compelling, explanation for what's a movement and what's not, what these guys just described. I mean, for me, I know I've been working on these issues for, several years, and I guess what I've seen, which I think is no small accomplishment, is that there is, huge capacity that didn't exist years ago around these issues, including infrastructure and all. Like, Raj and I are members, are part of a fellowship program that the Open Society Foundation put together. I guess it's been like 15, 18 years, and we go to these meetings together. That is like the infrastructure, a key part of the infrastructure of the criminal justice reform movement. It gets together every year, and really, it's amazing what those folks have accomplished. And that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago. And a lot of the organizing that's going on now didn't exist. So, I mean, I'm totally on board with the fact that this is a super fragile situation that we're in. Like, Glenn and I were just talking about Eric Holder's going to leave. What's going to happen after that? It could all, I don't want to say fall apart, but it's without that one person in charge who's really taking a lot of leadership, it's going to be very different. But anyway, in terms of our work, yeah, we interact with organizing groups of all kinds, domestic workers, fast food workers, unemployed workers, folks with records, and try to, as best we can, as a policy legal organization, really engage and be partners in our campaigns. And probably the best example of that is this campaign that we helped run with an organization called All of Us Are None here, based in the Bay Area, but national, to pass the state ban the black box law, AB 218, which just took effect in July. And it was a really good kind of microcosm, of how to experiment with that kind of relationship, how to try to figure out how to do it right. Because it takes resources to run a state campaign. It takes folks on the ground in Sacramento to really move things. Organizations don't have that kind of capacity. National groups, sometimes do, although I would not to overstate it, it's not a ton of capacity. So figuring out the dynamics of how to get it right, who sets the tone, who sets the agenda, who does the follow-up, who meets with the legislators, who meets with the governor when time comes to do that. That's all the real stuff that happens in trying to move a piece of legislation. And we try to do it as best we can, and a lot of that is about having relationships with the groups, creating the trust with the organizations. It's not a one-time deal. So, that's a little bit, I don't.
Can you give us a specific example of, maybe an action you planned or worked on, a piece of this campaign, perhaps something that didn't work as well as you wanted it to, and if the other panelists could maybe think about a similar instance that they can follow up with, whether, whatever that might be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we had to sit down with, I don't know how familiar folks are with this idea of ban the box. You take the criminal background check off the application, you move it towards the end of the hiring process. That's just kind of like the core component of it, but there's a lot more that you can do with ban the box. You can adopt various criteria that say, you can't look at a record over a certain period of time. There's a lot more you can do with it. So we had a big debate. Do we go with the bare bones version because that's what we can get past and maybe get past in Sacramento? It took 2.5 years to do it. And so we had to have a big discussion with the All of Us Are None folks and everybody else involved in that coalition with how to even structure the basics of the legislation, and then who was going to be out front with the legislator. Now, the legislator was very clear. NELP and these groups, they have a lot of profile up here, the unions. You got to bring the unions on board. We can't even introduce this bill if you don't have the unions on board. That wasn't what All of Us Are None. That wasn't that's not what they brought to the table. So we had to negotiate that, every step of the way with them. And I wouldn't say, in the end, it worked out. Everybody's super happy with the result. But, step by step, we had to deal with certain tensions. And that's just one example.
Yeah, what comes to mind, well, It's hard to have this discussion without saying a little bit about my background.
Please do,
So-
yeah. And anytime you feel you need to add context, all of you, go for it.
So I served 6 years in prison in New York State before I started doing this work 13 years ago, and then landed at a nonprofit public interest law firm, the Legal Action Center, and worked there for 6.5 years. And then left there to build an advocacy unit inside of a very large social service reentry organization in New York. So I've done this work from many different perspectives. First, while I was locked up, then inside of a very prestigious nonprofit public interest law firm that did work very brass tops, if you will, like build really strong relationships with conservative Republican senators to move things forward. And then at a reentry organization where a lot of the work was informed and developed by the 4,000 plus clients that we served each year, but I also learned some stuff about the limitations of doing the work from that vantage point also. And the reason I bring all that up because what comes to mind for me was Rockefeller drug law reform in New York State. So it was our effort to get rid of all the mandatory minimum drug laws that took our prison population in New York State from 12,000 to 72,000. And so there was this huge campaign called Drop the Rock. And there were a couple of bites at the apple, but what I remember in particular is that in 2006, Russell Simmons got involved, and there were a lot of sort of heavy-hitting lawyer types, policy folks involved. And I felt as though the community most impacted was there as a coalition to sort of build momentum to get the governor and the legislature to do something, but not in a really meaningful leadership role at the time. And we ended up getting reform where literally Russell Simmons ended up in the room with the governor and with the head of the Senate and the head of the Assembly. And in New York State, those are the people who run the government, period. They call it 3 men in a room, right? So they make all the final decisions. And so Russell ended up in that room and took what he thought was a win, and it was nowhere near a win. In fact, not only did the organizations working on it, not only were they disappointed, but people most impacted were hugely disappointed at what he was willing to capitulate to in that room. And then we had another swing at it a few years later in 2009, except it looked a whole lot different. Like it was me standing on stage handing the governor 40,000 signatures from communities most impacted. It was those communities telling the organizations like what they would like to see, where they would like to land, so that when those organizations went into the room, and it's not suggesting that they don't have the sophistication to be the ones there in that room, they should be, but when they went into that room, they had a sense of what their base cared about. And so, and there we had a huge win. We got rid of almost every single mandatory minimum drug law in New York State. I mean, our prison population is down 25%, hugely as a result of the win in 2009. But it was the campaign looked a whole lot different between 2006 and 2009 than it did leading up to 2006. And I think the key thing that looked different was the leadership of communities most impacted alongside other folks, right? So it's not to the exclusion of other people's leadership. It's just, you know, it's like, don't speak for us, speak with us. And that, I think, was the huge shift in the campaign.
Raj, if you could speak to this, if it's not from either from a policy organizing perspective or from the more level of the court-based work.
Sure, I've vast experience in losing. My expertise focuses on this, but I could tell you real quickly, and you all, I'm sure, have experienced this in courtrooms and cases you've worked on. You know, identifying the win in a case is such a skewed gray thing, unless it's a complete victory, right? So just when we get in those, we all, so our families meet once a week. Every week, as soon as their loved one gets arrested and they want support, they come to one of our weekly meetings. We call it now participatory defense. And they find intervention points of how the family and community power could intervene to change the outcome of the case. Sometimes families are doing sort of extensions of the legal defense team. They're reviewing discovery, they're going to the scene, they're comparing and contrasting what an officer said at the scene versus the prelim transcripts. They're making mitigation packets and videos if there's a conviction and before sentencing. But I can't tell you the number of times where we're celebrating someone getting 3 years in prison because he was facing 30 years in prison. And I can't tell you how, like, just dizzying the experience is to try to celebrate a lesser sentence just because we know what the impact is. That, I know that doesn't you know, informed. It's not a sort of right, brilliant conclusion, but I carry it every day. And the second thing I wanted to raise in the room, because of the theme and us kind of pressing the envelope a little bit, I think the example of the Rockefeller drug laws is a good one, and I think it's something that we're going to come up against every single time when we're thinking within the parameters of campaigns versus movements. Because there's a fundamental question and a calculus that happens in every single one of these campaigns. The question, whether it's articulated or not, is who are we willing to sacrifice? Who are we willing to sacrifice? And that's what makes it allowable for us to pass this. That anyone charged with a sex offense, they're the ones off the boat. Anyone that has a gang crime, they're off the boat. Anyone with a quote-unquote serious or violent felony, they're off the boat. At some point, if we're talking about movements, we're gonna have to find a new way to have that debate.
Can I just jump on in? Just gonna break all the rules now. I think what you're saying is so hugely important, and the reason I think that it's important is that the way we currently address this issue plays right into the existing rhetoric about the system, which is that this defendant didn't deserve to be there, this first-time nonviolent drug offender didn't deserve it, this was a bad judge, this is a bad cop. You know what? Americans lose sight of the fact that it's an entire system that's not working. And we play right into it when we're willing to have campaigns where we figure out strategically who we're willing to throw under the bus for a win. And, you know, the saying before was like the revolution will not be televised. I think the revolution will not be funded this time. Because a big part of it is, you know, how philanthropy works and how organizations are supported and people wanting to sort of carve out their space. And I don't think people, you know, these are all allies and colleagues and myself. I even try to be self-critical about it. And I think that we have not only adopted the language of an oppressive system to try to undo the system, but we've also tried to figure out how to score these wins within this sort of behemoth of a problem. And the truth is that if the response is not commensurate with the scope of the problem, then we're always going to be fighting a system that has a 45-year head start on us, if not a 400-year head start.
To pick up that point about language, because it, in so many ways, defines the structure of what we consider possible. Maybe could you tell us a bit about the ways that, perhaps in advocacy campaigns, how we refer to people who are part of this campaign or this movement or non-movement? Who are we doing it for? What do we call them? And why does it matter? And also, just trying to tie this again into the less policy or immediate policy focused work that you're doing. What is it like for the families who are involved in this advocacy to try to speak within the court system, which is even more narrowly circumscribed and where the language is so much more controlled even than it is when you're on TV trying to, you know, or let's say at a press conference. So fire away, all of them.
I mean, it's interesting because it's kind of, this should be Glenn's answering this question because he's working on these issues, speaking for the population. But it's probably maybe more appropriate for me to answer it because, you know, we deal with this all the time. You know, I would go into a meeting, everybody's talking about felons, ex-felons, violent offenders, all the categories that Raj just mentioned, and we're trying to personalize this, talk about people in these situations so that they're not treated as, you know, something other than who they are. And in fact, in our policy work, a lot of our policy work is about trying to communicate that too. In other words, like take licensing laws, right? You get denied a job because you have a felony, you can't work in the port or as a truck driver or whatever. In our policy work, what we're trying to do is create procedures, processes so that the individual situation has to be taken into account. Not just the record, but so we call that individual assessment or evidence of rehabilitation, all those factors. And it's a huge lift to get a lot of these laws changed just to get to that point where they're actually looking at the individual. So there's a lot of language discussion. I think we talk about people with arrests and convictions or people with criminal records. There's lots, but it's important to avoid those really negative terms or the terms that people don't even know that they're feeding into that kind of negative stereotype. But anyhow, so creating the sense that these are people who have lives, who have done a lot with their lives, before and after their convictions, that's really key to the policy. And we try to find ways to really bring that into play.
So, you know, NELT's work reminds us that there are 65 million Americans with some form of criminal record on file, right? And 19 million Americans with a felony conviction, I believe is the number. And that is staggering. And that's not the way we talk about this, right? We talk about this as if it's some small group of folks, hugely stigmatized, who are sort of, you know, who deserves and who doesn't deserve. And it's our job as advocates not just to convince people who sort of got us here that we should do things differently, but literally even to convince some of the people from the communities that are most impacted and remind them that these are their brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, and so on. So yeah, there's this huge movement similar to the gay rights movement to redefine people and rehumanize people. And you know, as daunting as it seems to cut the number of people in prison in half by 2030, there's a roadmap for what strong, meaningful social justice movements look like. All you have to do is look backwards, right? Looking forwards can be huge and daunting, but if you look at the gay rights movement, like there's some things that can be learned there. One of the biggest things is language. You know, how do people want to be referred to? Not just, again, for people who oppose us, but also for people from those communities so that they can be stronger allies. This morning I got an email from the Marshall Project, which is a brand new organization at the intersection of journalism and criminal justice, started by Bill Keller, who was at the New York Times as an editor for years. And you know, it said, Glenn, we want you to be one of the people we reach out to for, you know, op-eds and so on these issues. So, you know, if you have any really good stories about inmates, you know, let us know. You know, I said, how about this? How about my first op-ed be about language and journalism and how you guys have a responsibility of, number one, recognizing you're part of the reason we got here. And number two, that if you use humanizing language, we have a much better chance of achieving our goal. And I am happy to say that they actually invited that op-ed, so I'm going to write it, but yeah.
You know, just real quickly, the word that we have challenged, at least defense attorneys from using, or at least we don't use within the confines of our work, is client. And I think the theme of the panel is speaking to this, where the question is what your name defines what you're able to do and like your role. And so the reason why we don't use the word client when we have meetings is because client presumes that you're the recipient of the service. And what that means is that you're not the agent of change. And so it's why like we never called our work a legal clinic, because that is still the same dynamic. And so the question is, how can people that are directly impacted be given the license to actually transform the institution as they transform their own sense of power? And so we are very explicit about not using the word client. I don't have, for public defenders, I don't have a good, like, I don't know what they should call them. Like, I'll meet a public defender, like, what do I call people? You know, that's on you. But,
Calling people.
Yeah, calling people. So, but there is power in the language and in the name, because it dictates where you are on the chessboard. So, anyways, that's just a little thing.
Yeah, we stopped using, I mean, client, it's so funny because in the legal services world where I came out of, you know, there was a whole structure of representing community-based organizations. I don't know if anybody's ever, you know, they were your clients, you know. And thank God we, you know, we kind of broke loose of that quite a long time ago. I don't know how many other legal services folks have, but yeah, I mean, it's a ridiculous label, especially, you know, when you're in that situation where you're trying to make big changes and you actually have a relationship with the organization. It's not like, anyway, it comes up a lot in legal services, and it's a really good point to bring up.
So it seems like a lot of this discussion is kind of hinging on the knife edge, or maybe it's a giant gulf between a campaign and a movement. And I wonder if we could talk about how we get from campaigns to movements. And this is a related question that I was thinking about when you mentioned the analog, or maybe not analog, to the gay rights movement. Something that has always made me, even as joyful as I feel as I see the progress that has been made in that movement so quickly, I also feel a little bit of despair because part of the success has been built on the fact that anybody can have a gay relative, whereas the criminal justice system is hugely racialized. The impacts of it are racialized. I mean, it does affect all communities, but it's so tied in with structural racism and systems of power that there's a lot of structure to get at beyond people's individual attitudes. Yeah. So if that, you have anything to say to that, please do.
Yeah. So what I would say to that is that over the last 5 years, we have a lot of surveys and research and focus groups that tell us what resonates with the American public on this issue. And it clearly shows us that disparate racial impact does not resonate with Americans. And as much as we've been saying it for 4 decades, it doesn't move people. In fact, it moves people in the wrong direction. It reinforces for them that black people are inherently criminal when they hear that they're disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system. Just like stop and frisk in New York. You know, people see a black man up against the wall, the assumption is they're bad, they're doing something wrong, and they probably deserve to be up against the wall. So I think the first thing is recognizing that if you're going to have a strategic movement, that everything you say may not always come from the lens that you feel most comfortable with. So I think the field is responsible, the field of criminal justice reform, progressives, have made the mistake of meeting the general public to get this issue from the lens that they use, right? So I'm not hung up on framing this as a civil rights issue or even a social justice issue, because what I'm hearing from the research is that pragmatism is what works best with Americans to help them have a discussion about the criminal justice system. And so as an organization, we're going to be messaging differently we're a membership organization, so we're going to be messaging differently to our members as a nonpartisan organization and being really thoughtful about what's going to resonate with different audiences. And if we really care about a movement, then we have to move out we have to feel comfortable doing that. The thing about how do you tie this all together and take it from a campaign to a movement, for me, is about values. So people often say, well, Glenn, if you're going to cut the criminal justice system and have you, the advocates, your movement, what does that look like? What does the new criminal justice system look like? And I don't think I have to answer that question. I think I have to answer what are the values that we like to see as Americans in a criminal justice system that represents who we say we are. And I think that that's something that binds people together, and I think the progressive left has been all too willing to stay away from a conversation about values because it's been really hijacked by the right in this country, and I think that that's a huge mistake. But the way I think we pull it all together is by having the voices of people most impacted, helping to sort of set the agenda in terms of values. And so things like having a criminal justice system that thinks about parsimony, right? So who gets what, for how long, how much time do you do, that thinks about social justice, that I think there's just some core values that we can push for in a redesigned criminal justice system that'll easily move us away from the one we currently have that doesn't have any of those things. But it has to come from the voice of people most impacted.
I could just offer a little example to drive the point home about the racialization of the system. You know, again, we do a lot of work around criminal background checks for employment, trying to make the process more fair and all. And there's a major piece of research that we keep coming up against. It just drives us crazy. By this Georgetown, super respected professor, where he found that it's better to do more background checks than less background checks for people of color, because employers walk around assuming that if you are an African American man, that you're going to have a record. So you are eliminating the possibility that the person has a record by conducting the background check. So that just, to me, that's just, proof positive of what we're up against. And I really agree. I guess I'll just be, a little contrary here. I think we have to find a way with all these great policy campaigns to link up to these values. I don't think we, even Prop 47, which is huge. There are a lot of issues with Prop 47. It leaves out everybody without, it picks and chooses exactly what.
Could you say very briefly what that is and why everyone should?
Yeah, Prop 47 and stuff like that. And it basically reduces 6 felonies down to misdemeanors, including drug possession and grand theft and a few other, through other offenses that cover a lot of people. So it's no small thing.
I might be mistaken, but I think those were originally wobblers under the law, which means they could have been misdemeanors or felonies based on the whim of or the discretion, let's say, of the prosecutor.
Exactly.
So it's
and after the fact, you can walk in. You can walk in after the fact now and ask a judge to, if you have one of those felonies, to reduce the felony to a misdemeanor, which is a big deal for employment purposes and lots of other purposes. But anyhow, but it's picking and choosing in a big way. It's leaving out a lot of people. So it's doing what Raj was talking about before. So but at the same time, it's opened up a big conversation. I mean, here in California, I'm actually from New York as well, so I was familiar with what was going on out there. And it's been a while since we've had a high-profile conversation about criminal justice reform of this sort. And so we can't walk away from that. And we have to figure out a way how to marry these things, how to bring the values to some of these conversations, and because the policy wins, help build momentum, and we can't ignore that either. So I guess I'm kind of like, I don't have the answers.
I actually don't think you're being contrary, because I think, if I'm right, Prop 47 came after the judge made the decision that California needs to do something, right, about its prison system. It wasn't that based on some provision within the Constitution, I guess, right? That's a values conversation.
Right, yeah.
You know, I think that's a values conversation. So the courts decided that the way that California's current criminal justice system looks doesn't line up with who we are, based on the Constitution.
They did so in response to litigation. So this is maybe a good time to kind of tie this into one of the things on my mind. This is at a law school, but a lot of these are law students, or maybe lawyers. What is the role, what should be the role of lawyers who are trying to embody these values in their work? And please keep in mind that, especially if you want to get involved in social justice work, it's pretty hard to get a job. It doesn't matter who you are or where you went to school. It's tight, Like you were saying, the way philanthropy works, there's not always money going where we want it to, and we might be hoping to become a public defender, say, within the structure of a public defender's office, where you're within this legal culture, or working at an advocacy organization that is very based in litigation, which is a very cerebral, kind of technocratic culture. How can we, and maybe how have you seen people fail to exercise or embody these kind of values that we're talking about? Does that make sense? Could I ask you to start, please?
Sure, yeah, and I think it's a good, it follows the last line of discussion. I think if there is another movement that we could draw some lessons from, and where there's some comparisons in terms of the institutional powers that we have to face and go up against, it's the environmental justice movement. And that's also this area, East Palo Alto, right next Palo Alto, was ground zero for a lot of the most powerful, historically significant lessons and battles fought for environmental justice. But it was that larger sort of vessel that Glenn was talking about that allowed these advancements to move forward. So the lessons are that the principles can direct these sort of fork in the road moments for the campaigns. And if the principles, which by no means are sort of easy declarations to make, it's not going to be like 10 principles on every sort of community organization's wall. They're going to have to be debated, argued against. People are going to hate each other, never talk to each other for years. If you look honestly at some of these other movements that are deeply committed. But the end game is that the principles become baked in. So that, like, the idea of, like, you couldn't do environmental justice if you didn't have people that were breathing those toxic airs from that chemical waste plant at the leadership role. It is totally illogical within the framework of those principles. We need to think of the movement against mass incarceration in that same sort of way. And it doesn't have to be a decision between being effective or being principled. Because we saw typically very marginalized communities with no economic political power going up against very, very powerful institutions, multi-global corporations, and taking them down. The roaming plant just across this bridge doesn't exist because elders in East Palo Alto, as well as 14-year-olds in East Palo Alto, shut it down. So it doesn't have to be the romance or the tangible wins, it could be both. And real quickly around, I think you said what the role of public or attorneys can be. If the principle's baked in, and one of those principles very well can be humility, can absolutely be humility. And so we don't see our organizing style as somehow being like a watchdog in police, a public defenders. We're saying there's a real synergy and a real teamwork, that if these two saw each other as partners in a movement, we could do amazing things, like bring attorneys to misdemeanor arraignment, because the attorney may not be able to move as freely in exercising his political power outside of a courtroom, and the community can. So I was at a community-oriented defender network meeting a couple months ago, and I said that we tell our folks that your public defender is the sharpest weapon that you have in your toolbox. And we meant it sort of a compliment, right? That's how we see it, like that the primary person isn't the public defender, it's the person that's facing the charges. And you wield your weapons to win your war. I had an attorney come up to me later and say, you know, I've never heard attorneys being called tools. So the idea is that sometimes the humility might allow you to see possibilities that weren't there before.
In response to that question, I would say this. You know, my hope actually for people who want to get involved in public interest work on an issue like this, a social justice issue, my hope is actually that a very small number of people in this room end up doing that. My hope is actually that, no, let me finish my thought, here we go. My hope is that you all sort of go out and work in many, many different areas of our society and take this with you and realize that our criminal justice system is a repository for people who fail out of all of our other policies in the United States. And so where you can have the most impact is actually not necessarily in this space, but wherever you land. So even if you're a corporate attorney at a really large corporation, I see some people cringing, but you can impact this issue from that space. You know, we're doing leadership training with people who are formerly incarcerated to help build their leadership capacity, this 10-month-long training, and people say, well, Glenn, are you going to only train people who are sort of in the social justice movement? And absolutely not. Like, I want to bring in people who are formerly incarcerated, who are working in corporate spaces, working in government, and so on, because, you know, tonight, if you're going to listen to Michelle, she's going to say we need a social movement, and I know she's going to say that because she keeps beating that drum. And she's right, and yet social justice movements are made up of many, many moving parts, and they're better defined sort of retrospectively, if you will. And so it means that I hope that folks who hear about this and hear about it sort of fan out and do their piece from many different vantage points.
Yeah, I mean, I for the folks who do want to go into public interest, I think it really is a challenge. I can't, you know, as an employer, it's really difficult, and I attribute a lot of it, and Glenn mentioned funding is part of it. You know, the craziness around fellowships and all that is a whole other part of it. You know, it's kind of perpetuating a lot of inequities in the way people find work and, you know, pay for their education and all that. So it's a real challenge. You know, the best advice I have really is to develop as many skills as humanly possible. You know, don't think of yourself just like a lawyer. Think of yourself as somebody who's capable of doing all those other things that we all end up doing in the real world in our job. I mean, when I started in law school, you know, yeah, you went to a legal services office, you did housing cases, you did unemployment cases, but now that's not really what it's like. There's some legal services offices that operate that way, but I tell you, most of the public interest organizations, that's how we end up doing policy work. We do policy work, we do communications, we do it all, we try to. And maybe that's spreading ourselves thin, but that's my best advice to folks who are looking for work in public interest, or probably a lot of other fields these days too, is, you know, grab as many of those skills as you can, really develop them, and then apply them, you know, where you decide, you know, you really have the passion to go for it, because it's a long haul, and if you don't have the passion from the beginning to, you know, to go into this field or that field, you know, it's going to be super frustrating. So, but there are, you know, I don't want to, it's not all bad news. I mean, there are jobs out there, but it takes a long time. I mean, that's, you guys know that way better than I do. I mean, you're around for, we do a lot of work around unemployment and deal with the recession. And I talk to folks, your generation and folks my generation, who are having the exact same problem. They can't get their foot in the door even. You can't get human contact. You know, everything's done online and all that. And so it's a challenge for everyone. It's not just for you guys. But those are some of the things that in my position, I see really making a big difference.
I want to open it up for questions from the audience, so please take a minute and think about that. But before we do, is there anything else that any of you had on your mind that you wanted to say here today, or part of this conversation you can get to? Check your notes for a second, and I'll just keep talking so it's not dead air. Just, that's fine. I just want to give you that opportunity.
I mean, I'll jump in because as you were sort of painting that doom and gloom picture,
Thank you.
I just wondered whether I was painting a similar picture. And so to be clear, in the 13 years I've done this work, there's not been a moment where lawyers haven't helped me to move the issues forward, period. It's a certain type of lawyer, right? It's usually a recovery lawyer. But still, like every piece of my work is lawyers helping me. Even right now, as I'm building this new organization, I'm working very closely with Fred Diggum at the Law Clinic at Columbia to help build the advocacy toolkits for our leaders. I'm working with Susan Stern at the Center of Institutional Social Change at Columbia Law on helping to do some research and help to build a curriculum for the leadership training. And then once we dive into the advocacy work, like that work can't get done without lawyers at the table, but it's lawyers like Debbie, like when I was at the Legal Action Center, Debbie is a lawyer who thinks way outside the box. Like she takes her skill sets and her training as a lawyer, but she recognizes that success in this space means that lawyers are listening to the other stakeholders, and that's what I've always admired about her and her approach to the work. And many of the lawyers I've worked with since then, Maurice and others, have a very similar approach to the work.
All right, so we don't have any mics in the audience, I don't think, so you can raise your hand and tell us your question. I'm going to repeat it in the mic, and it'll be on tape. Yes, sir.
My question actually dovetails a lot with the last question that you posed, which is for those of us who are very concerned with the nature of criminal justice in this country and how we can have the most impact, what would you think, what advice would you give to those of us who want to make sure that we have the best marginal benefit? Is that one more public defender, one more ethical prosecutor, one more person working on policy? Where do you think we can have the best impact?
That's a great question. So just for the tape, that was for those of us who are concerned about these issues and we're going to become lawyers, where do you feel we can have the most impact, even if it's the most marginal impact, one more prosecutor, one more public defender, etc.?
I think we've handed over our criminal justice system to prosecutors. We have taken discretion away from judges and other people in that space and really given it to prosecutors. And I will say if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And it's a big part of how we got here with these length of sentences or people trying to avoid really lengthy sentences and taking pleas. And so I actually think that really smart, thoughtful people landing in the space of a prosecutor and utilizing that discretion until we fix the rest of this madness is a good place for people to be.
Yes, yes.
So mine's going to be like comments versus, questions and comments at the same time. So my thing is, I'm so happy that we're trying to reduce the amount of people who are going to jail. I think we need to also focus on how the jail, prisons are ran. Like, it shouldn't just be punishment, like, it would be different if people were actually gaining something. That's why when people rejoice when it's 3 years versus 30 years, because it's like, it's a waste of life. You're going to jail, and I'm wasting my life. There's nothing being done. There's nothing, I'm not gaining nothing from it. And then once I leave jail, I'm being punished again by my society because I can't get a job, I can't get housing, I can't get anything because I was sent to this place. I feel like if we were to change the way jail, the prison was ran, like if we were to give more skills, education, because that's what some people who end up in jail lack. They lack the skills, they lack education, and that's what got them to that place. Like, if you were to focus on putting in more programs, more things to help them once they leave, and then the society will be more trusting. Like, oh, you went to jail, it's actually good. You have like, you have all these skills that some people may not have gotten because you were forced to be in this place. So like that's the punishment, being forced to open your book, being forced to learn the skill that you might not have learned in the regular life. That should be the punishment. Like being, it's not. I don't know where I'm going with this, but I feel like that's what needs to be focused on if we're going to have this prison. Which it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing if we were to change what's being done. It's no longer like rehab. It's more so punishment, and not only is the punishment inside. Once you release, you're punished again, which caused you to do some stuff to get back.
100, I think we probably all agree on that. Do you have any questions specifically?
No.
All right, that's fine. Thank you. No, that's beautiful. Thank you very much. I believe these things are pretty sensitive, and I hope they caught that. Yes, in the back.
Hi. Raj and Glenn, I think both of you mentioned this, but in every movement or campaign, we have to sacrifice someone, and I'm curious what you think we're sacrificing right now from your perspective.
So the question was, in winning some of these concrete policy gains, or maybe in movements more largely, was actually the question was phrased, we often end up sacrificing somebody or some people. Who are we sacrificing right now?
I can answer real quickly. I think the way to locate who's being excluded is to look at the ballot initiatives, and they say everyone will get this advantage except for those groups. And to be candid, it's folks with serious felonies or quote-unquote violent felonies, sex offenders, people who have been given sex offenses. It's people that have been convicted of having gang charges. Just to name a couple of very specific groups that are it's almost like it's accepted that the starting line is by leaving them out. Like that's where you start. But I want to say too that it's possible to change that discussion and sort of that perception. And I do think it's by having community be able to look under the hood of the criminal court system. Like Glenn was saying, it's not always just the conservative outsiders that watch Fox News that have this perception. It's folks in the neighborhood, it's folks in the community. And so everyone has bought sort of this marketing line of who is inherently bad and evil and who's not. The only thing that gives them a different opinion in my experience is if they've been through the court system and they know where the labels are coming from and what it means. And to give you a quick example of how that transition can happen, when you look at immigrant detainers, which has now nationally, counties are not honoring immigrant detainers. I'm sure people here are pretty familiar, lightweight, with how those work. Those are holds that happen if someone is in jail. The local jail system will hold them until ICE officials come to get them to question them or send them to immigration detention and deportation. Santa Clara County, just a couple years ago, had the most progressive immigrant detainer policy in the nation. Thankfully, the rest of the country has caught up to Santa Clara County. But the reason we were able to get that win is that we didn't fall into the lie of who was the good immigrant and who was the bad immigrant. And that was hard work that could have severed a lot of relationships. Because our organization worked with folks that were catching those cases. We're catching what ICE would call level 1 serious offenses. And we knew that those people had families, and those people had American lives, and there would be consequences that were just not tolerable. But the immigrant rights groups who weren't familiar with the criminal courts had no point of reference. All they had was what ICE was essentially saying, was that we don't want to deport folks that get arrested for bad driving behavior or a low-level misdemeanor. But we certainly don't want to risk the public safety and allow all these quote-unquote dangerous felons to stay in this country. The only way we changed that is we literally had a meeting where we brought folks from our organization that have those cases on the record and had them talk to the immigrant rights advocates. And we were able to change the perspective and then get them on board so they didn't have to buy into the lie. I think that type of dialogue can be happening consistently. So movement building isn't about catching the right marketing line. It's about something much more complex and profound.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Some of the students have appointments with attorneys in this event, networking event. But I hope, thank you all for coming. I hope we continue having this conversation.